Big lifts and big tires have been a completely appreciated and trendy style for lifting vehicles since the 1900s. While they might look cool, they're not actually ideal for quality on and off-road street and trail use. Big tire, big ground clearance, could also be called HCG. HCG builds focus on achieving ground clearance through really tall lifts and really big tires. While HCG builds are oftentimes great for extreme terrains, they often come with trade-offs like stability and on-road steering manners, making them less ideal for your daily driven Jeep or off-road rig. You're gonna wanna watch this video where we dive deep into the concept of LCG, or low center of gravity Jeep and off-road rig lift builds. Now, why would you wanna do this? Jeeps, forever, their advantage is the fact that they have a low and narrow wheelbase. The disadvantage is, man, they roll over. If you were doing a steep hill climb or an off-camber maneuver, you might unload the suspension, and continuing to keep a low center of gravity actually is a huge advantage. The idea is that we have a relative articulation, travel, and roll center necessary to keep you, the occupant, safe while still getting to do all the cool things off-road that you would like to do. I specifically love this idea of taking big, massive tires, tall fenders or fender flare extensions, a appropriately rated shock travel and suspension modification, which will then allow articulation in a stock manner, or if you do a long arm with limited amount of lift. And so you keep this kind of low planted feeling, which is the ideal way to do an LCG build. So as you're exploring doing an LCG build, one of the components you're going to want to explore is basically weight distribution. Now, we talk about this a lot, even with our standard built Jeeps and off-road rigs, that if you have a really heavy front end and a light rear end, it may be disproportionate for your use on the trail, or vice versa. And we've all seen the Carolina squat, and arguably nobody in the off-road community likes that. And so you end up with this peculiar looking vehicle where, you know, you have too much weight in the rear and not enough in the front, and you inadvertently end up with a Carolina squat. No good, especially when it comes to key components as far as scrub radius for your tires and caster angles. And that actually has everything to do with how your vehicle handles on the road. So ultimately, as the rear settles down and the front end lifts up, it basically plays with our front end alignments. As the nose comes up and it gets lighter in the front end, your caster actually depreciates, making it handle a little more squirrely. Equally, you move out of the range of ideal for shock and spring valving and rates. So it's really important when we're figuring this LCG that you're doing springs and shocks and weight distribution, which is going to keep the vehicle level through the majority of your utilization. Is there going to be the odd time when you've got a load full of people or you have to carry some firewood in the bed of your JT? Sure, I get that. But overall, you're going to want to gear your build for your major or primary utilization. Figure out where your batteries are going to go, where your load is going to go, your off-road recovery equipment. Figure out what weight you're going to add to the vehicle, and then choose your springs and shocks accordingly. Back in the day, we used to just kind of log on to a base website, or even further back, just opened up a catalog or a booklet and we picked a lift kit, and you didn't really know what springs or shocks you were getting. You just kind of picked it via lift, and the only thing we were achieving was lift. Now LCG takes into consideration ideal shocks, springs, and weight distribution through the process. So if you're going to be adding winches, extra batteries, extra occupants, heavy off-road gear, bolt-in or weld-in roll cages, fuel, water, I don't know, a camper, whatever, you're going to want to have that stuff figured out long before you consider lifting your vehicle, because all of those things are going to directly impact your enjoyment on and off-road. So what are some of the pros and cons of an LCG? Big thing is we're going to have as flat of steering as possible. The specific advantage or pro in this process is this short drag length or steering input. I now feel way more connected to the road and my maneuvers as a driver than I would in a HCG or high center of gravity build. So we have this huge advantage when it comes to the drag length and steering input. Additionally, our roll center, it's cut exponentially down from a HCG. LCG arguably has less wear and tear on your suspension components. That has a lot to do with leverage and energy transfer. Long arms are unquestionably the smoothest energy transfer on and off-road that a Jeep or off-road rig can have. Now, with that said, I used to use the analogy of T-Rex arms. When we did a HCG, high center of gravity build back in the day, as you lift vertical height without extending those lower control arms, it inherently draws the axle inboard to the center line of the vehicle from front to back. It actually shortens your wheelbase. So not only are you going up, but you're going in at the same time. Additionally, now that we've shortened it, we've actually started to rotate everything down and back a little bit, and it actually makes for a harsher and less pleasant ride no matter what terrain you're on or off-road. It's just no good, no dice, no fun. LCG doesn't do that. Because you're not increasing the distance exponentially between the axle and the upper point of the chassis where the spring sits, those control arms sit in a more appropriate plane than a high center of gravity is. So they're closer to factory. So there's less wear and tear on the control arms, less harshness or rigidity in the frame rail. So LCG is a more fluid suspension operating in a more appropriate plane of geometry, and high center of gravity is typically more of a rigid suspension. So it's just harsher all the way around. LCG is also more cost effective, or at least it can be. Realistically, you can do a fender delete, a stubby bumper addition, or let's say you're really doing on the cheap, just cut the ends of the bumpers off, and you can clear 37s with arguably no lift. So what are some of the negatives? What are the cons of LCG? Turn radius is going to be affected because of body contact or control arm contact of the radius of the tire to the full lock turn radius of the vehicle. Ultimately, you just need that open concept to allow the tire to move through its full range of motion. When it comes to suspension articulation, the likelihood of the radius of the tire touching the body of your off-road or on-road rig is very high. So at that point in time, you may be needing to bump stop or add bump stop to your suspension travel, which could increase the harshness of your, drivability. Additionally, from tires, rubbing, and clearancing issues, you also have the inherent lack of ground clearance. So you gained some ground clearance inadvertently just with the minor amount of lift that you used and the lift that's inherent with the oversized tires. But realistically, the breakover angle will still be a limiting factor. That means your belly of the vehicle is now closer to the obstacles than it would be with a higher lift in general. And so the advent of skids or flat bottom skids is way more critical with an LCG than say a vehicle that's lifted appropriately and able to go over obstacles with more ease. So how do you start your LCG build? The big takeaway is try to make body modifications over suspension modifications, and make suspension modifications only when necessary. Planning your build can go two different directions. You can do the DIY, or you can take it to a professional and have them work you through the process. You're going to want to address those things like I had mentioned earlier in the video, as far as caster angles, steering geometry, the correlation between caster and pinion angle and lift height, breakover angles, and roll center. There's a bunch of other technical terms that we could get into and kind of noodle on while planning your build, but realistically, you're gonna want to understand that your goal is not just vertical rise or lift and looking cool in the Walmart parking lot, but that your goal is a highly functional vehicle in a multitude of environments the majority of the time. Now, as you're planning your process, there are going to be a couple common or specific challenges you'll encounter. LCG at its truest form is slightly more technical. So your local shop or your approach might not have the time or ability to do that, and it might just be outside of their knowledge base. So choose wisely what your process and what your objective is going to be. There are absolutely challenges in picking parts that work and don't work. Ensure that your budget, your time, and that your build allows for it. So at the end of this, LCG is my personal favorite form of suspension modification. For our average consumers, especially in your JKs and your JLs, the biggest your lift should ever be is typically 2.5 to 3.5 inches. Now, we do have the individual who pushes to 4.5 inches, and we are capable of accommodating for that for a multitude of other aspects that your Jeep might encounter. Again, steering and caster angles, control arm lengths and energy transfer from that point, drive shafts, all of those things have to be considered in that process as you increase that vertical lift height. With that said, I'm gonna make the emboldened statement that you should not be buying a 6 or 8 inch lift for your JK or your JL or your JT at this time in the market and what we know in the industry. If that is on your radar, and it might be, you need to understand that many of the lift kit manufacturers are just getting you into the ballpark of lift and not actually ensuring that your Jeep handles as well as it can or that it should. So if you do think you're gravitating towards that big lift, then you have to understand you're just at the start of the race, not near the finish line at all. Realistically, most people who call in and talk to me or message us online who think that they need that big lift height, they're from the suspension world 20, 30, 40 years ago, and they're still noodling on that high center of gravity build. Basically, if you like how your Jeep rode and handled in a stock configuration and you just wanted it to be bigger, LCG is the answer for you. There's varying forms of it. You can do it on a budget, you can do it on a mild build budget, or you can get wild and extreme in the process. You might recognize one of our Jeeps, Johnny 5. That Jeep is actually not intended to be lifted very high, but it has long arms front and rear, has beautiful range of motion out of the suspension, and it just reasonably looks proportionately well. As I talked about Chuck Norris before, Chuck was actually built for 40s. That means that when we ran through the range of motion, that 40 tucks up inside the body armor exactly right. If I was to go and try and put a bigger tire on it, now I'm actually going to depreciate the utilization of it. Could we go a hair bigger on it? Maybe, but realistically, that sweet spot, that balancing act of suspension modification and on and off-road stability, control, maneuverability has been optimized in these lower center gravity builds. Now it's your turn. Now we need to know what you have done. How much lift is under your Jeep? How did you arrive at choosing to do that. And do you think that yours is an LCG build, an HCG build, or realistically, you don't know because you just kind of bought what was on sale and threw it under your Jeep? We'd love to know about that. We really want to know and hear from you. We read and respond to almost all comments that are made on our videos. You know, realistically, you might teach us something too in the process. And hopefully you found the video, you know, informational and valuable to planning your lift job before you make the mistake of doing massive lift and poor on and off-road manners.